Transport Secretary Grant Shapps joining us from just down the road on Abingdon Green. Minister, very good morning to you. You'll have heard that breaking news in just the past couple of minutes, the statement from EasyJet that they could now be grounding the majority of their fleet.
Yeah, that's right. I've seen that statement. Look, I'm meeting with the whole of the transport sector this week, but mainly to feed into an economic and business committee chaired by the Chancellor, in order that we can do what we've said all along, which is we understand this is a crisis like we haven't seen before, where businesses which are otherwise sustainable, otherwise good businesses, of course, should be able to survive through this situation. And that's what we're going to be trying to put into place for all businesses and individuals in this country as we join this great national effort to defeat this virus.
We know that even before the statement from EasyJet that they are going to be cancelling a number of flights, that there were noises coming from the aviation industry that they might be requiring a bailout of sorts. Are you minded to provide it?
Well, we know that aviation, of course, is at the forefront in many ways because the first thing that stopped is travel internationally in particular. But actually, we want to, make sure that, as I said, companies and individuals, organisations who are in a good state, not those that were going to fail anyway, but in a good state, are able to continue. And so we'll be looking at all of these measures. I'll be discussing them with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister later today, and those discussions with the sector are ongoing, including summits I've got in transport, with rail, road, aviation, hauliers later today and later this week.
It sounds very much like bailing out the airlines is an option that remains on the table, for now at least.
Well, look, there are lots of different options here, including some other things that people have been looking for. For example, HMRC offer a time to pay. There's obviously issues over the way that various different taxes, regulations fall. Last week, week before, I was very active in ensuring that airlines weren't having to pointlessly fly what I was calling ghost planes, empty, half empty, fully empty, because there was a slot allocation rule at airports, and I lobbied the European Commission to change that, and indeed they have changed it. So there are lots of different ways to assist. But this is now a great national effort that every organisation, every individual, every citizen in this country and indeed around the world is having to join in order to make sure that we can and will in the end defeat this virus.
I wonder if we might speak more generally about the government's response to COVID-19, and many people will welcome the announcement that there are going to be daily televised briefings from the government. We'll talk in more detail about the government's communication strategy in just a second. But many people watching this will be of one mind, with one big question in their head. What is it that the government knows, that the CMO, the CSO, the Prime Minister knows, that means that our approach to tackling COVID-19 is markedly different from pretty much the rest of the world?
Well, I think that if you were looking for the sort of uniqueness of the British approach, it would simply be those initials you mentioned, the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Officer. It is a real desire to be driven by the evidence and by the science. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that our approach is markedly different, as you say, but I do think it means that we deploy each of these different measures at the appropriate time, and there'll be another COBRA planning session later today, the Prime Minister will chair, that I'll be at, where we'll be discussing all the things that were in that overall action plan issued near the start of this crisis. So we are just being entirely science-led. We're not doing the things that sometimes perhaps are happening elsewhere just because it seems like a populist thing to do. We want to know that the scientists back it, and that's, I suppose, the hallmark of this country's response.
But the accusation that is being made is that the government is reacting in some cases, in some ways, more slowly than European partners, the United States. You'll have heard the news about Los Angeles and New York, simply because the health service cannot cope as it stands. Figures from the NHS released in January show that in terms of critical care, we're nearing capacity even before COVID-19. Over 4,000 adult critical care beds, 3,500 of them are occupied, 312 paediatric intensive care beds, 247 of them occupied, and all that before We expand the system, try to hire new intensive care nurses. I mean, how confident are you that there is the capacity to treat people?
I don't think it would surprise any of your viewers that, of course, something like this, at the scale of this virus, is an enormous capacity challenge for any health system throughout the world. It doesn't matter where you are, but just because of the size and scale of it. And of course, it is also the case that it makes a lot of sense to ensure that we do things to try to manage the pressures on the health service. But the actual decision making, as you've seen, and you've seen the Prime Minister, you'll see it again today, flanked by those medical and scientific experts. Every single decision that we've made has been based around, well, what does the science say? What's the medical evidence? And we're going to be actually publishing all the background evidence. And of course, it's quite right that some people will have different opinions, and we want to hear those opinions, because it's very, very important that we get this right. But we are making every single possible effort to do that, and doing it in a completely transparent way. I would say the UK has probably just been at a slightly different stage, obviously compared with places like Italy, but also a little behind where France and Germany are. And it's not that we're not going to get there, but of course our responses are timed in a different way, unique to the particular stage of this that we're in the UK.
But at this stage in the spread of COVID-19, we have the Health Secretary issuing a call for help from industry to expand the number of ventilators available to the NHS. We spoke over the weekend to one person who didn't think that was necessarily practicable. Let's just have a listen.
The biggest providers are in America. Guess where they're going to supply? The next biggest, strangely enough, is New Zealand, and they're looking after the Southeast Asia. The rest are Europe. And of course, guess where the European manufacturers are going to sell their stuff to? Because, it's to Europe, and we're not in Europe anymore.
What information have you had that suggests that we will be able to mass produce ventilators in the coming weeks?
First of all, we've been buying ventilators over the last few weeks and months, so that's been an ongoing process. Secondly, we are in Europe still. We don't physically, geographically move. And if you were listening to some other radio broadcasts this morning, you had chief execs of very large advanced manufacturing organisations who are very much up for the manufacturing of ventilators. In fact, I've had two approaches from constituents companies, advanced manufacturers, this weekend, and today there'll be a phone number coming live today and an email address for people who want to offer manufacturing assistance. That will be a BASE, that's a business department number that will come available. I think this is all part of sort of this great national effort to work together and do everything we possibly can as a nation to solve this problem and make sure that we protect the elderly and the vulnerable in our society, who are the people who are most likely going to be the ones who would need the ventilators themselves.
I wonder if we can talk about the way in which the government has been communicating its strategy to the wider public. There has been some confusion. We had the Chief Scientific Officer talking about herd immunity, then the Health Secretary saying it wasn't part of the strategy. You had the Prime Minister in his press briefing saying that we didn't need to ban mass gatherings, then briefing to the press that was a strategy going forward. Do you think the government has been in command of communications?
Actually, I mean, the action plan published right at the beginning actually outlines virtually all these things. So, things like home isolation and, households staying at home, even elderly and vulnerable people staying at home. All of those things are already outlined in the action plan. The question really, I guess this is what you're coming to, is really that of timing and when each of these different elements come in. And again, we will be driven by the scientific advice on this, which I think is absolutely the right approach. You can never over-communicate, I entirely agree with that. But I do think that it's important that we do not get knocked off the course of what this country has done very well so far, which is to follow the medical and scientific advice rather than doing things which just sound good, but perhaps don't have the right impact at the right moment in time.
Why then did the government announce that millions of people over the age of 70 may have to be isolated for as much as 4 months? Why did they announce that through an anonymous briefing to a political editor, a political journalist, and not the Prime Minister standing at a lectern, or yourself or the Health Secretary speaking to the public directly? Why is public health policy being given to the public via anonymous briefing?
That's just not true. If you look at the action plan, which was published at the beginning of this, it's literally written in there. So it's just not true, that accusation. But also, I mean, I would say it's useful before we're actually asking over 70s to isolate. My parents, for example, in their 80s, my father 88, I was speaking to them this weekend and helping them to set up an online shopping account so they can get their groceries delivered. It's practical and helpful for people to know what's coming down the line, which is why it was written in the action plan itself, in order that they can get themselves prepared. And
unfortunately, look, my mother, for example, hasn't had the opportunity to read the action plan. My mother discovered that she may very well have to spend 4 months in her own home, away from her family, through an anonymous briefing to a political journalist. Now, we heard from the Health Secretary at the weekend the following. Let's just have a quick listen to this.
But just to be crystal clear on the elderly, the government will be asking the over 70s to self-isolate, potentially for a period of months, at some point in the future.
That is in the action plan, yes, and we'll be setting it out with more detail when it's the right time to do so, because we absolutely appreciate that that is a very big ask of the elderly and the vulnerable, and it's for their own self-protection.
Made it absolutely clear that he does not feel that that was the right time to talk about it, the right time to provide detail on that particular piece of public policy. A large part of the strategy instead emerged on a blog, on a Facebook post written by a political journalist and not from electorate. So again, I ask, do you think that the government is completely in control of the way in which it is informing the public?
I'm afraid I can't be in control of every blog that a political journalist decides to write, but what I do know is, as the Health Secretary just said, it's actually in the action plan, which was widely covered by the newspapers at the time, including that point. And I think it is useful for you and me, people with elderly parents and relatives, to be able to prepare them. And this is what it is. I mean, I can't tell you otherwise. This is a big national effort required for an international crisis, and people will need to prepare in that way. That's why we're moving to daily press conferences from today as well. But our approach is to be completely open with it, publish all the information, all the background, and try to give people the best possible advice as we pull together as a nation to defeat this thing.